The 27th of May, 1940. Near Castle, France. Captain Pat Reid of the Royal Army Service Corps raised his hands as German infantry surrounded his position. The ammunition was gone. The retreat to Dunkirk had become a rout, and his small unit stood no chance against the Wehrmacht's advancing columns. A German officer barked commands Reid didn't need to understand. The war, for him, was over. Or so the Germans believed. Reid watched his service revolver disappear into a German pack and felt rough hands search his uniform, his men being lined up along a bullet-scarred wall. The engineer's mind, trained to solve problems methodically, began cataloguing information even in surrender: guard positions, weapons, terrain features, and escape routes that might exist in the chaos of victory. Within hours, Reid joined hundreds of other British and French prisoners, marching east under armed guard, away from any hope of rescue. The column stretched for miles, a river of khaki shuffling through French villages, where civilians watched with tear-streaked faces. German motorcycle troops raced west toward the collapsing Allied lines as Stukas screamed overhead. The Third Reich's war machine rolled forward while its captives trudged toward an unknown fate in Germany. 3 days into the march, Reid made his first escape attempt. He slipped away from the column during a rest halt, crawling into a drainage ditch and working his way toward a nearby tree line. He covered 200 yards before a burst of machine gun fire stitched the ground near his head. Dogs barked, and rough hands dragged him back to the column, where a Wehrmacht sergeant delivered a rifle butt to his stomach. Reid doubled over, gasping, but noted the guard positions had gaps and the dogs were poorly trained. The next attempt would account for these factors. The sergeant noted his name on a clipboard: troublemaker, escape risk. The labels that would follow Reid for the next 5 years had begun accumulating. The prisoners shuffled past propaganda posters showing German soldiers standing victoriously over defeated enemies. Civilians spat at them, children threw stones. An elderly woman screamed at Reid in German, her face twisted with hatred for the English who had dared oppose the Führer's will. The guards laughed, but maintained order, their Mauser rifles always ready. This was Germany in triumph, 1940. The war seemed won and Britain stood alone. These prisoners represented a defeated enemy. Reid studied everything: the rail yards they passed, the military installations visible from the road, the types of uniforms the guards wore. His engineer's training transformed every observation into data for future use. Laufen Castle came first, an ancient fortress in Bavaria converted into Oflag 7C for British officer prisoners. Reid arrived in early June 1940, processed through a system already well practiced at handling captured officers. The Germans photographed him, fingerprinted him, issued him a prisoner number, and confiscated his remaining personal items. The castle sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, its medieval walls now topped with barbed wire and guard towers equipped with searchlights and machine guns. Swiss representatives from the protecting power inspected the camp and found conditions adequate under the Geneva Convention. The German commandant assured everyone that officers would be treated according to international law, promising no forced labor, adequate rations, and male privileges. It was the illusion of civilized captivity in an increasingly uncivilized war. Reid lasted 3 weeks before attempting his second escape. He and another officer studied the guard routines during evening appel, noting a blind spot in the searchlight coverage where the castle wall met a storage building. On a moonless night, they scaled the wall using a rope made from braided blankets, reached the top, cut through a wire, and dropped 15 feet to the ground outside. Freedom lasted 48 hours. The local Gestapo arrested them at a railway station 20 miles away, 2 British officers in ill-fitting civilian clothes. The interrogation was brief. The punishment was solitary confinement, 7 days in a basement cell with a wooden bench and a bucket. The notation in Reid's file grew more emphatic. Persistent escape risk. Requires transfer to higher security facility. August 1940 brought Reid's third escape attempt at Laufen. This time, he concealed himself in a laundry cart, being taken outside the castle walls. A guard's bayonet, thrust casually into the linens to check for hidden prisoners, missed Reid's body by inches. He held his breath, waited for the cart to pass through the main gate, then burst from the pile of sheets and ran toward the nearby forest. Guards' shouts echoed off the mountain slopes as rifle shots cracked through the alpine air. Reid zigzagged between trees, his heart hammering, before tracker dogs cornered him against a rocky outcrop. This time, the punishment was 14 days in solitary confinement. This time, the German High Command made a decision. Captain Pat Reid had earned a one-way ticket to the Reich's special facility for incorrigible escapers. On the 7th of November 1940, Reid stood shackled in a railway car with a dozen other persistent escape artists from camps across Germany. The train rattled northeast through Saxony toward a destination the guards refused to name. The other prisoners shared similar stories: multiple escape attempts, disruption of camp routine, and a refusal to accept captivity. One was a Polish cavalry officer who had escaped 4 times from camps in occupied Poland. Another was a French lieutenant who had made it to within 50 miles of the Swiss border before recapture. These were not ordinary prisoners. These were men the Wehrmacht had designated times Deutschfeindlich, times hostile to Germany, requiring special measures. The train arrived at a small station near the town of Colditz. The prisoners were unloaded and marched through cobblestone streets toward a massive cliff that dominated the landscape. Atop the cliff sat a castle that seemed to grow organically from the rock itself. 7 stories of grey stone walls, narrow windows, steep slate roofs, and a single bridge spanning a deep ravine to reach the main gate, Colditz Castle, O-Flag IVC. The escape-proof prison for the Third Reich's most difficult captives. Reid stared up at the medieval fortress and felt something unexpected. Not despair, but intense interest. The engineer in him immediately began analyzing the problem. Every fortress had weaknesses, every system had flaws. The Germans believed this place was escape-proof. They were about to discover that belief was their first mistake. The main gate closed behind the new arrivals with the finality of a tomb ceiling. Guards marched them across a cobblestone courtyard surrounded on all sides by sheer walls rising 70 feet high. Barbed wire crowned every parapet. Guard towers jutted from corners, manned by sentries with machine guns. More guards patrolled the walls above and occupied the inner courtyards and checkpoints. The castle's medieval design, with its multiple layers of walls and gateways, had been adapted perfectly for prisoner containment. To escape would require passing through at least 6 separate security barriers. The German security officer, Hauptmann Paul Priem, watched the new arrivals with cold satisfaction. Let them look. Let them see the impossibility of their situation and let reality crush their spirits where punishment could not. Processing took hours. Every prisoner was searched again, photographed again, and fingerprinted again. Reid's photograph shows a lean-faced man with steady eyes, his uniform worn but maintained with military precision. The Germans issued new identification cards stamped with red warnings. Fluchtgefahr, escape danger. The camp commandant, Oberst Edgar Gleisch, addressed the new arrivals in accented English. This was Colditz. This was where troublemakers came and where escape attempts ended. The castle had stood for 1,000 years. Any man who attempted escape would face the severest punishment under military law. Cooperation would be rewarded. Resistance would be crushed. Reid was assigned to the British section, housed in the castle's eastern wing. The room was a former servants' quarters with stone walls 2 feet thick, a single window reinforced with iron bars, and wooden bunks stacked 3 high. 15 officers shared this space designed for perhaps 6. The senior British officer briefed Reid on the camp routine. Morning appel at 0600 hours, midday soup, evening appel at 1800 hours, and lights out at 2200 hours. Between these fixed points, prisoners could move within designated areas, the library, the small courtyard, the common rooms, but always under watch, always under guard, always trapped within walls that had witnessed centuries of confinement. The first night at Colditz, Reid lay on his thin mattress and listened to the sounds of the castle, guards' boots on stone floors, keys rattling in locks, distant shouts in German. The wind howled through the medieval corridors. Other prisoners snored or muttered in their sleep, while someone coughed continuously, a wet tubercular hack that spoke of declining health in the castle's damp conditions. Through the barred window, searchlights swept the outer walls in regular patterns, their beams cutting through the November darkness. Reid watched the lights, timing their movements, noting the gaps between sweeps. His engineer's mind was already at work. The British prisoners at Colditz had developed their own culture of resistance. Unlike ordinary POW camps, where men gradually accepted their fate and waited for war's end, Colditz housed only those who refused to stop fighting. The castle contained British, French, Polish, Dutch, and Belgian officers, each nationality maintaining its own escape organization. Intelligence was shared, tools were hidden, and guards were studied for weaknesses. The Geneva Convention guaranteed certain rights, and the prisoners exploited every loophole, pushed every boundary, and tested every limit. If the Germans wanted to concentrate all their troublemakers in one place, they would discover that concentration created a critical mass of ingenuity and determination. Reid met the other British escape artists over the next days. There was Lieutenant Airy Neve of the Royal Artillery, captured near Calais. Flight Lieutenant Howard Wardle, a pilot who had escaped 3 times. Major Ronnie Littledale, who had cut his way through wire at 2 different camps. There were dozens more, each with his own specialty. Forgers who could create false documents, tailors who could modify uniforms into civilian clothes, scroungers who could obtain contraband materials, and linguists who spoke perfect German. The Germans had gathered the most talented escape artists in the Reich and locked them together. The results would not be what the Wehrmacht intended. By his second week at Colditz, Reid had identified his first potential escape route. A disused attic space above the British quarters. Accessible through a locked door the guards rarely checked. If a man could reach that attic, he might find a way to the roof spaces, and from there, perhaps, a way down the outer walls. It would require keys, rope, and precise timing of guard patrol skills. Reid didn't possess alone, but that existed collectively among the prisoners. The plan began forming in his methodical mind, each step calculated, each risk assessed. Colditz might be escape-proof in theory. Practice, Reid suspected, would reveal something different. But Reid remembered something from his engineering training. The more complex a system, the more potential failure points it contains. Colditz's multiple walls and barriers weren't just obstacles. They were opportunities for exploitation, blind spots where human attention flagged, routines that could be predicted and used. The Germans had made the castle their ultimate answer to the escape problem. Reid intended to turn their certainty into his advantage. 4 British officers would eventually walk out of Colditz's main gate in broad daylight, disguised as German workers, but that success lay months ahead. Built on foundations Reid began laying during his first days in the castle. He stood at the barred window, looking down at the town of Colditz far below, at the river Mulde winding through the Saxon countryside, at the forests stretching toward horizons that meant freedom. The Germans believed he was trapped. They were right about the castle's physical security, but wrong about something more fundamental. Pat Reid had spent his first 29 years solving problems. Colditz was simply the most important problem he had ever faced, and failure meant spending the rest of the war behind these ancient walls. The stakes could not be higher. The challenge could not be greater. And somewhere in this supposedly escape-proof fortress, an engineer's mind told him there had to be a way out. Chapter 2. Reid stood at morning appel, November frost, biting through his greatcoat as 300 officers assembled. The German guards counted with meticulous precision, cross-referencing names against the master roster. Hauptmann Priem, the security officer, moved through the ranks with theatrical slowness, studying faces. The ritual consumed 90 minutes, prisoners locked in rigid formation. Reid watched Priem pause before Lieutenant Michael Sinclair, a notorious escaper, examining his features against a photograph before moving on. The system was thorough, designed to catch any substitution. Reid noted the guard towers with their overlapping fields of fire and the sentries at each entrance. The cold seeped into bones, breath steaming in the air. When dismissal finally came, they dispersed to assigned duties. Reid's work detail was in the German administrative offices that afternoon. Colditz's unique character was immediately apparent. Unlike purpose-built camps, it was a medieval fortress where captor and captive spaces mingled. The German Kommandantur occupied the outer courtyard's eastern range, a warren of offices for Wehrmacht clerks. British prisoners assigned as orderlies moved through these spaces daily, emptying bins and sweeping floors under escort. Reid found himself scrubbing a corridor lined with filing cabinets, a guard named Gebhard watching with bored attention. The work was menial, but the access was extraordinary. Through open doorways, Reid glimpsed the Reich's bureaucratic machine in action. Yet its complexity created seams. Orderlies moved in and out multiple times a day, and guards grew accustomed to their faces. Familiarity was breeding the first crack in vigilance. By the second week, Reid recognized patterns. Guard shifts changed with clockwork regularity, the 5-minute handover creating brief confusion. Certain guards, like Gebhard, treated orderly duty as an easy assignment, more concerned with the Kommandantur's coal stoves than with their prisoners. The corridor Reid cleaned led to camp records and personnel files. A stairwell at its end descended to the castle's lower levels, ostensibly off-limits but accessible during the chaos of orderly duties. Passes for the courtyard archways were simple, stamped cardboard, easily reproducible. During evening lockdown, Reid shared these observations with Lieutenant Airy Neve, a recaptured escaper whose methodical mind grasped the implications immediately. The German administrative section wasn't just offices, it was a disguised exit route. December's grinding routine established itself. Appel in darkness, work details, a meager meal of cabbage soup and black bread, then lockdown. Reid watched men adapt differently. Flight Lieutenant Howard Wardle maintained fitness through relentless exercise. Captain Julius Green withdrew into quiet despair. But others, like Major Ronnie Littledale, who was fluent in German, volunteered for every orderly assignment, absorbing information on guard procedures and administrative routines. They were not breaking, they were transforming captivity into reconnaissance, cataloguing every interaction for future exploitation. Reid observed that Kommandantur clerks treated British orderlies with a contempt that bordered on invisibility. A prisoner emptying waste bins became furniture unworthy of close supervision. Hauptmann Priem's security inspections focused on traditional escape vectors, prisoner quarters, tunnels, and mail censorship. The notion of prisoners walking through German administrative spaces seemed too audacious to warrant countermeasures. The Kommandantur occupied the outer courtyard's eastern and southern ranges. Beyond lay the German garrison and the castle gates. British orderlies were already inside this outer layer daily. What prevented them from penetrating deeper? By January 1941, Reid's mental map of Colditz held extraordinary detail. He knew Guard Corporal Shadlick replaced Gebhard on Tuesdays and Thursdays and read novels on duty, his attention fragmented. He knew the stairwell at the corridor's end saw minimal traffic between 1,430 and 1,530 during German staff briefings. He knew the commandantur's lower level contained storage rooms prisoners could legitimately access for cleaning supplies. Most critically, he discovered that several of these storage rooms had windows overlooking the outer courtyard's southern edge, where the castle wall dropped to a steep, unguarded slope. The Germans had fortified the obvious escape routes, but the windows in administrative storage, spaces theoretically inaccessible to prisoners, had no special reinforcement. Prisoners couldn't reach them, so why bar them? The death of Captain Michael Duncan in late January crystallized the stakes. Discovered in a tunnel beneath the chapel, the 40 feet of painstaking excavation had ended in catastrophic collapse. The Germans didn't need to beat him. Weeks underground in freezing conditions, the failure of the escape, and poor nutrition had broken his constitution. He developed pneumonia, and the German doctor's professional competence couldn't save a body that had exhausted its reserves. He died on February 2nd, buried in the Colditz cemetery with the military honors extended to officer prisoners. Reid attended the funeral, watching Oberstleutnant Ehrengott deliver formal condolences. The commandant's sincerity was irrelevant. Duncan died because Colditz was designed to defeat conventional escapes tunnels, wire cutting, wall climbing. Every month spent on such methods was a gamble against deterioration. Standing in the frozen mud of the cemetery, Reid's perspective transformed. He understood escape couldn't be conventional. The Germans had perfected Colditz's defenses against obvious attempts. Tunnels were found, disguises penetrated, wire cutters drew gunfire, but their thoroughness created a blind spot. They fortified prisoner spaces while assuming their own administrative areas were inherently secure. Walking out through the German offices, dressed appropriately during the confusion of a shift change, this inverted the escape equation. Instead of breaching German security from the outside, they would exploit it from within. Reid shared his revelation with 3 officers on February 10th. Lieutenant Iri Neve, with his German fluency and escape experience, Lieutenant Hank Wardle, a Canadian with unflappable mechanical skills, and Captain Rupert Barry, an actor with an obsessive eye for costume and character. Reid laid out his observation. British orderlies were invisible within the commandantur. The lower-level storage rooms had windows to freedom, and guard shifts created predictable gaps. They needed German uniforms, forged passes, timing, and the audacity to walk through the castle's administrative heart. Neve grasped it instantly. We don't escape times from times Colditz. We escape times through times Colditz. Wardle was already problem-solving. Uniforms mean tailoring. We need German cloth, proper insignia, Barry nodded, and movement patterns. We need a reason to be there. Exactly, Reid interrupted. We become the people they expect to see, not the people they're watching for. The technical challenges were staggering. German uniforms had to be perfectly tailored from scarce materials. Forged documents needed to match Wehrmacht standards. Reconnaissance and timing had to be flawless. Yet, for the first time, Reid felt possibility grounded in concrete observation, not just desperate hope. As February's cold settled over Colditz, the team began systematic preparation. During orderly duties, Reid noted which storage rooms offered what views. Neve traded Red Cross items for intelligence on guard routines. Wardle identified prisoners with peacetime skills in tailoring and printing. Barry studied German guard behavior, noting posture, gait, and salutes. The work proceeded in fragments, each man contributing specialized knowledge toward a unified goal. Walking out of Colditz, hidden in plain sight. The possibility crystallized on March 3rd. While Guard Corporal Shadlick was absorbed in his novel and afternoon briefings had emptied the upper floor, Reid descended the stairwell on a legitimate errand for cleaning supplies. He strode with purpose to the lower storage level and entered the 3rd room on the left, ostensibly for floor wax. He was alone. The window was ordinary, with a simple latch. It overlooked the courtyard's southern edge, where the wall transitioned to a steep hillside leading toward Colditz town. Reid's hands trembled as he opened it. Freezing air rushed in. The drop was perhaps 15 feet to a narrow ledge, then an accessible slope. It was not easy, but it was not impossible. He closed the window with barely a sound. Climbing back to the main floor, Reid knew they had found it. Not a tunnel requiring months of digging or a desperate dash over walls, but a route that exploited Colditz's fundamental assumption that prisoners and Germans occupied separate, supervised spaces. By walking through German areas as Germans, they could reach a window the guards never thought to bar because no prisoner could possibly access it. The castle's greatest strength, its elaborate administrative apparatus, had become its exploitable weakness. They just needed to become invisible by becoming exactly what the guards expected to see in the brief moments no one was checking. Chapter 3. Summer 1942, Colditz Castle. After nearly 2 years of watching and orchestrating dozens of failed but brilliant escape attempts, Major Pat Reid knew a profound change in strategy was needed. The tunnels beneath Colditz, marvels of covert engineering, had been discovered one by one, each requiring months of backbreaking, claustrophobic labor only to end in the stark misery of solitary confinement for the diggers. The rope descents from high windows, audacious feats of athleticism, had left men dangling like puppets against the ancient stone walls, easy targets for the sweeping searchlight beams and the crack of rifle fire that followed. The wire-cutting attempts, meticulously planned, had triggered shrill, unforgiving alarms before men could even breach the outer perimeter. Reid had watched it all, documented everything in a hidden log, and participated in several attempts himself, feeling the familiar sting of failure. Every conventional method of escape had been tried, catalogued with cold efficiency by German intelligence, and systematically countered. The security measures grew tighter with each new failure. More guards patrolled the battlements. More roll calls, often at unpredictable hours, broke the prisoners' sleep and resolve. More invasive, humiliating searches tore their few possessions apart. The castle that was supposed to be escape-proof was grimly, inexorably, becoming exactly that. The breaking point arrived on a humid Wednesday morning in late June. Reid stood at the grimy window of the British quarters, his gaze fixed on the inner courtyard below. He watched a small group of French civilian workers exit through the main gate after completing masonry repairs. The guards barely glanced at them. There was a cursory check of their essuies, a few bored words exchanged, and the massive gate swung open with a groan. The workers walked out into freedom with the casual indifference of men finishing an ordinary day's labor, their shoulders slumped with tiredness, not fear. There were no dogs straining at their leashes, no invasive body searches, there was no suspicion at all. There was only the power of bureaucratic routine and the absolute German faith that these men belonged on the outside because their official papers said they did. Reid's hands gripped the cold iron of the window frame, his knuckles white. 2 years of painstakingly elaborate schemes, of complex tunnels requiring engineering genius, of dangerous climbs that demanded extraordinary athletic skill, all ending in capture, solitary confinement, or bullet wounds. And here, less than 50 yards from where he stood, men walked out through the very front gate simply because they wore the right clothes and carried the right pieces of paper. The stunning simplicity of it struck him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Why were they trying to go under or over the walls when the gates opened several times every single day? The German obsession with documentation, hierarchy, and procedure had created a massive vulnerability they couldn't even perceive. They trusted the uniform and the stamped document more than they trusted their own eyes. The idea was utterly insane. It was also, he realized with a surge of adrenaline, absolutely perfect. Reid turned from the window and began walking through the castle with fresh eyes. He was no longer a prisoner cataloguing the features of his prison, but an intelligence officer surveying the terrain of a new operation. The guards changed shifts at predictable times, the routine ingrained and unvarying. The civilian workers arrived and departed on relentlessly regular schedules. The German officers moved through the castle with the unthinking confidence of absolute authority, never questioned, never stopped, their presence its own justification. Their uniforms were their passports to freedom of movement within this cage. The realization crystallized from a fleeting thought into a hard, diamond-like certainty. They didn't need to break out of Colditz. They needed to walk out. Reid began observing everything with a new, predatory focus. During the mandatory exercise periods in the courtyard, he no longer shuffled aimlessly like most prisoners, head down against the despair. He watched. He studied. The guard at the main gate checked papers, but never truly examined faces. Why would he? The papers were official, the uniforms were correct. German military efficiency was built upon the bedrock of trusting the system. The gate guard's job wasn't to suspect everyone, it was to verify documentation. Reid noticed the guard grew more careless toward the end of his long shift, tired and visibly eager for relief. He catalogued the details of the civilian workers' simple blue coveralls and the worn leather satchels they carried. Most importantly, he observed the German officers, noting their immaculately tailored uniforms, peaked caps, and the way they carried dispatch cases with an air of purpose. He saw how junior officers and enlisted men instinctively stepped aside, their bodies physically making way when a senior officer approached. The castle itself revealed new possibilities under this intense scrutiny. The British quarters were near the prisoners' designated recreation area, but they also shared a wall with a wing where German administrative offices operated. There were moments each day, during shift changes or meal times, when guards moved through these transitional spaces without particular vigilance, their minds focused on their own duties, not expecting to find a prisoner anywhere they shouldn't be. The key was looking like you belonged. More than that, it was acting like you belonged with every fiber of your being. The German military mind operated on the rigid tramlines of hierarchy and procedure. Violate neither visibly, and you could move anywhere. Reid began cataloguing resources with clinical precision. Uniforms would be the most critical component. Several prisoners, he knew, had been tailors in civilian life. The castle had a surprisingly active theatre group where prisoners produced entertainments, which meant there was a secret cache of fabrics, dyes, needles, and thread. German uniforms had been studied extensively by prisoners, hoping to use disguise for a quick escape over the wall, though never with this level of audacious ambition. The theatre group had created convincing costumes for the stage. Could they create utterly convincing Wehrmacht officer uniforms? Could the resident forgers create the necessary documentation to pass a close inspection? Reid knew they could. The real question was whether he could assemble a team courageous and foolhardy enough to stake everything on walking out the front door in broad daylight. The psychological shift within him was immediate and total. Reid had survived 2 years of captivity by maintaining a grip on hope through constant planning, through his contributions to the escape committee, through the simple act of staying mentally active. But that hope had always been abstract, a distant light always deferred to the next attempt, the next tunnel, the next daring scheme. Now, hope became concrete, tangible, and terrifyingly immediate. This could actually work. The sheer audacity of it, the element of psychological warfare it contained, appealed to something deeper in him than the mere survival instinct. To walk past armed German guards in perfect German uniforms, to exploit their own rigid system against them, to make them unwitting accomplices in their prisoner's escape through their blind faith in procedure, it was resistance at its purest. It was refusing to play by the enemy's rules of captivity. Reid approached Major Ronald Littledale first. They had known each other before the war and had been captured together during the fall of France. Littledale, a fiercely determined officer, had attempted escape 3 times already, earning weeks in the solitary cells for each failure. He was a Royal Tank Regiment officer with a precise mind and absolute unwavering determination. Reid found him in the dusty camp library, pretending to read a German newspaper while actually studying the guard rotations visible through the window. Without preamble, Reid leaned in and said quietly, "Ronnie, what if we walked out the front gate dressed as German officers?" Littledale didn't laugh. He didn't even question the sanity of the idea. He simply lowered the paper, looked at Reid for a long, searching moment, and replied with 2 words, "When do we start?" Captain Bill Law was the 3rd recruit. Law possessed formidable engineering expertise and had supervised 2 of the most ambitious tunnel attempts. His value wasn't just his technical skill, but his unshakable temperament. Escaping in disguise required nerves of absolute steel, a moment's hesitation, a bead of sweat, a flicker of fear in the eyes, and discovery was certain. Discovery meant being shot before you could even think to surrender. Law would need to maintain perfect composure while walking directly toward armed guards in what they would see as stolen enemy uniforms. When Reid outlined the plan, Law's response was characteristically blunt. Better than digging for 6 months just to hit another medieval foundation wall. He was in. Lieutenant Hank Wardle completed the core team. Wardle was younger than the others, but had proven his mettle during the chaos of the Dunkirk evacuation and in the grinding reality of captivity. Crucially, he spoke serviceable German, which could be the difference between life and death if anyone questioned them. More importantly, he had the natural bearing to carry off the impersonation of a Wehrmacht officer. Confidence wasn't something you could fake, it was an aura. You either had it, or the guards would sense the deception immediately. The 4 men began meeting in secluded corners of the recreation yard, their conversations masked by the general noise of hundreds of prisoners exercising and socializing. They spoke in fragments and code, never discussing the full plan where eavesdroppers or the ever-present threat of informers might overhear. Reid formally coordinated with the Central Escape Committee, which controlled the secret flow of resources and prevented duplicate efforts that could compromise everyone. Some committee members thought the plan was glorious suicide. Walking directly toward armed guards in enemy uniforms violated every instinct of concealment and stealth that governed all previous escape attempts. But Reid argued the profound psychological advantage. The guards expected prisoners to be furtive, to hide, to sneak. They would never expect prisoners to walk confidently through the main gate at midday. The technical challenges were formidable. German officer uniforms required excruciatingly specific details. The correct piping, collar tabs, and shoulder boards for their chosen rank. Buttons bearing the right insignia, authentic-looking leather boots, and peaked caps with perfectly replicated Wehrmacht eagles. The documentation would need to pass inspection by guards who saw these papers every day. Forging of this quality required true artists who could replicate the complex German stamps and Gothic script signatures flawlessly. The theatre group had talented craftsmen, but this was a world away from stage costumes. These uniforms would be examined from 3 feet away by men trained to spot discrepancies. Reid calculated the timing. Late summer or early autumn would be best, long enough to prepare everything perfectly, but soon enough that the raw desperation driving the plan wouldn't fade into complacency. Every day in Colditz was a gamble of sudden transfer to worse camps, of the war turning against Germany, and prisoners being executed out of spite, of simply dying from disease or despair. The news from the Eastern Front, smuggled in on secret radios, suggested German armies were advancing deep into Soviet territory. If Germany won the war, the prisoners faced indefinite captivity or worse. If Germany lost, the fanatical SS might execute all inmates of Colditz as a final bloody act of revenge. Either way, time was a luxury they did not have. The risk calculation was brutal but simple. Stay in Colditz. Certain continued imprisonment, a high probability of transfer or death before the war's end, and an absolute guarantee of more suffering. Attempt the disguise escape. An extremely high chance of being shot on the spot, a minuscule chance of success, but at least the possibility of freedom and the certainty of having tried. The cold mathematics of desperation made the choice obvious. Reid had already accepted that he would likely die in this war. The only question left was whether he'd die actively trying to escape or die passively waiting for whatever fate the Germans decided for him. The decision was solidified during a particularly brutal roll call in early July. A prisoner from the French quarters had been caught with contraband tools and was savagely beaten in the courtyard where everyone could watch. The guards wanted the message to be understood. Resistance meant suffering. But as Reid watched the sickening display, he felt only a cold, hardening determination. They wanted their prisoners broken, compliant, and too afraid to resist. Walking out the front gate, wearing their own uniforms, would be the ultimate refusal to break. It would prove that even in Colditz, even under the heel of maximum security, the human will to freedom could not be suppressed. Reid made the final, irrevocable commitment standing in the castle courtyard, watching the July sunset paint the stone walls amber and gold, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping fingers. Beyond those walls lay occupied Europe, hundreds of miles of enemy territory, countless checkpoints, and hostile patrols. Even escaping Colditz was only the beginning of an even more perilous journey. But he had survived Dunkirk. He had survived 2 years of captivity. He would survive this too, or he would die trying. There was no third option anymore. The plan was insane, desperate, and terrifying. It was also the only plan that might actually work. The preparation would begin immediately. Tailors would start creating the uniforms from dyed blankets and scraps. Forgers would practice their art on stolen paper. The 4 men on the team would study German mannerisms, military protocols, and the exact way Wehrmacht officers moved, spoke, and carried themselves with unquestioned authority. They had 3 months to become convincing enough to fool dedicated guards at point-blank range. The work began that night, in darkness and whispers. The impossible escape from Colditz had moved from fantasy to operational planning. They were going to walk out the front gate. Chapter 4. Walking out the front door. The audacious plan crystallized in July 1942, when Major Pat Reid watched German electricians pass through the Kommandantur Gate without inspection. 4 men, white coats, tool bags, a nod to the sentry, and the gate opened. Reid's mind recorded every detail, their confident stride, the casual way they held their equipment, and the exact timing of the shift change when guards focused on their replacements rather than the castle grounds. Most prisoners studied walls and wire. Reid studied human behavior. Weeks of observation compressed into a single insight. Colditz's impenetrable stone walls meant nothing if you convinced the guards to open the gates for you. Disguise was theatre, and theatre required actors who could perform under the certainty of execution if discovered. Reid needed men who could walk past armed sentries without their hearts exploding, men who could nod casually at a felled Weibull while every nerve screamed to run. Lieutenant Commander William Stevens was first. A Royal Navy submariner and survivor of HMS Seal's capture, 2 years in camps, had taught him the controlled breathing required when air ran thin. Reid approached him during the exercise period. "Can you walk past a guard without showing fear?" Stevens' pale blue eyes held steady. "I've stood on a flooding submarine deck, waiting for Germans to board." "Yes." 1 ally secured. Flight Lieutenant Howard Wardle came next. An RAF pilot with 3 previous escape attempts, he was constantly watched. But Wardle possessed a perfect German accent from a childhood in Hamburg. He could bark orders if needed, selling the performance where a British voice would shatter everything. Reid found him in the library and whispered the plan's skeleton. Wardle's hand trembled slightly on his book. 2 days later, a nod during roll call confirmed him. For the 4th man, Reid chose Lieutenant Colonel Ronnie Littledale of the Rifle Brigade. Older, steady, he was the kind of officer German NCOs expected to see escorting workers. His role required no German, just aristocratic bearing and absolute confidence. Littledale listened to the proposal in the chapel during Sunday service, hymns covering their words. The plan meant walking past multiple sentries, through the forbidden commandantur courtyard, then out the main gate. Littledale's response was immediate. The requirements were deceptively simple: 2 convincing German Feldwebel uniforms, 2 Flemish workman outfits, and identity papers that could pass casual inspection. The execution demanded months of meticulous work under constant surveillance. Littledale and Wardle would be the fake sergeants, Stevens and Reid the workers. All 4 needed papers identifying them as electricians authorized to work throughout the castle. The uniforms came first. German Feldwebel tunics required cloth that didn't exist in prisoner quarters. The breakthrough came via Lieutenant Gebhard, a corrupt guard who could be bribed with Red Cross chocolate. Over 6 weeks, they made small purchases: field grey cloth scraps, buttons, and insignia from damaged uniforms. Each transaction was a gamble. Gebhard could report them at any moment. In a hidden workshop behind a false attic panel, tailors worked by candlelight. RAF squadron leader Brian Padden, a former West End costumer, cut patterns from memory and stolen glimpses of guards. The cloth had to drape correctly. German uniforms fit differently than British, and a sentry's eye would catch wrong proportions. Padden's hands shook from malnutrition as he stitched, each seam potentially perfect or fatally flawed. The work took 3 months. The workmen's overalls were equally challenging. Blue cloth was sourced from blanket dye, a chemical process whose stench required explanation. Cleaning solution, prisoners claimed, showing mops and buckets. The guards accepted it, but their heightened suspicion led to weeks of sharpened inspections. Reid watched guards increase random cell searches, knowing discovery would mean reprisals against the entire camp. The overalls progressed anyway, worked on at night and hidden during the day. Identity papers were Wardle's domain. Forged documents required photographing each man in costume, creating official stamps, and matching the bureaucratic language of Third Reich paperwork. A camera was improvised from a tin box and stolen lens components. Gebhard supplied the film for more bribes and more risk. The photography happened in stages, each man posing in partial costume when guards were elsewhere. The flash powder burned their eyes and stank of sulfur, but miraculously, it didn't bring the guards running. The stamps and seals came from artistic skill. Captain Dick Howe, the camp's escape officer, had spent months recording German documents he glimpsed. He sketched from memory, refined the drawings, and carved stamps from linoleum stolen from the German officers' quarters. The Colditz commandant's signature was practiced hundreds of times before the final forgeries, which looked authentic enough to fool a casual glance. Then came the close call. On the 23rd of September 1942, Hauptmann Priam, the security officer, led a supposedly random inspection through the British quarters at dawn. Prisoners were herded into the courtyard while guards searched cells, tapping walls and examining floorboards. Reid stood at attention, watching the search party move toward the attic workshop. The false panel wouldn't survive a determined investigation. Inside lay uniforms, papers, and enough evidence to see them all shot. The search party climbed the attic stairs. Reid's heart hammered against his ribs. 15 meters away, Germans were about to discover 3 months of work and condemn his team to execution. Priam's voice echoed, ordering thoroughness. Time stretched, each second infinite. Then a shout from the courtyard below. A prisoner Reid never learned who had staged a dramatic fainting spell, collapsing and convulsing. Guards, including those searching the attic, rushed down. The German medical officer was summoned, and the inspection was suspended while the prisoner was carried to the infirmary. The diagnosis was low blood pressure and malnutrition. The inspection never resumed with its initial intensity. The workshop remained undiscovered. Reid visited the young lieutenant that evening. "You saved us." The man's response was quiet. I saw where they were heading. Seemed like the moment. One man had risked punishment to buy others a chance, his calculation instant. Collapse now or watch comrades die. Reid returned to the workshop with renewed determination. The debt could only be repaid through success. Final preparations intensified through early October. There would be no second attempt. The costumes were fitted and adjusted repeatedly. Wardle practiced his German commands until they sounded authoritative. Reid rehearsed the electrician's movements, testing sockets, checking wiring, projecting a casual competence that would deflect notice. Littledale studied how German officers walked and carried themselves. Stevens memorized Flemish phrases, though silence was the goal. The date was set, October 14, a Wednesday. The evening shift change at 4:30 p.m. created maximum confusion. Autumn darkness fell earlier, limiting visibility. Most critically, intelligence from a bribed guard indicated Hauptmann Priem would be in Leipzig. Without his suspicious eye, their odds improved from impossible to merely suicidal. The morning of October 14 dawned cold and grey. Reid woke before the bell, his stomach knotted. This was the day. An acceptance of death brought clarity. Most Colditz attempts ended in recapture or death. The odds of 4 men walking out the front gate were infinitesimal, but not zero. Breakfast was forced down against nausea. Stevens pushed porridge around his bowl. Wardle's eyes were fixed with suppressed fear, and Littledale ate calmly, a veteran who knew terror was useless before action. Around them, other prisoners maintained careful normalcy. The costumes were donned in stages. Each piece had been hidden separately. By 4 p.m., Reid stood in a full electrician's coat, tool bag in hand. Looking in a mirror fragment, he saw a German worker, not a British major. The disguise was visually complete. At 4:15 p.m., the 4 met in a storage room. No dramatic farewells. Dick Howe, the escape officer, gave a single nod. The moment had arrived. Reid checked his watch, 4:27 p.m., 3 minutes until shift change. Littledale adjusted his Feldwebel cap. Wardle clenched his jaw. Stevens gripped his worker's cap, then deliberately relaxed his fingers. 4:30 p.m. The shift change began. Reid opened the door and stepped into the prisoner's courtyard. White coat bright, tool bag swinging, he walked toward the gate to the Kommandantur courtyard, the forbidden zone. Behind him, Littledale and Wardle in Feldwebel uniforms flanked Stevens, the workman. The first sentry at the gate watched Reid approach. 10 meters. 5. Reid held his forged papers visible but didn't stop. The sentry nodded and stepped aside. Behind him, the sentry saw the Feldwebel uniforms, saw authority, and waved the group through. They were in the Kommandantur courtyard, where prisoners were shot on sight. Reid spotted a disconnected light socket he'd noted weeks before. He walked to it, pulled out a screwdriver, and began testing it in full view of multiple guards. The performance sold the deception. Guards glanced, saw nothing suspicious, and looked away. Heart hammering, Reid worked with steady hands for 1 minute, then packed his tool and turned toward the main gate. Littledale, Wardle, and Stevens had maintained their formation. They walked with purpose toward the final barrier. The gate sentry stood alert. This was the test. Reid fell in behind them. The sentry watched them come. Littledale gave a confident nod. Wardle kept his expression neutral. Stevens kept his eyes down. Reid maintained his stride, an electrician leaving after a job. The sentry's eyes swept over them. The uniforms correct, the worker subordinate, the electrician plausible. Everything seemed normal. His hand moved toward the gate release. They were walking out the front door. The castle's reputation as an inescapable fortress meant nothing against 4 men who convinced the guards to simply open the gate. No tunnel, no wire cutting, just theater, nerve, and the understanding that humans see what they expect to see. The gate began to swing open. Beyond it lay the outer courtyard, the town of Colditz, and the path to Switzerland. They stepped through the main gate of Colditz Castle. Behind them, hundreds of prisoners. Ahead, the October evening and kilometers of hostile territory. The sentry watched them pass, unaware he had just released 4 British officers. The gate closed behind them. No alarm. They walked across the outer courtyard, forcing their legs not to run. They approached the final checkpoint, the outer castle gate and the road to town. One more sentry, one more performance. The theatrical gamble continued, their lives depending on not breaking character. The outer gate guard looked up. The escape was in motion. Behind them, Colditz Castle loomed. There was no turning back, only forward, into the night, into the desperate hope that audacity could carry them beyond the reach of the Third Reich. Reid forces his eyes forward as the train station platform scrolls past the window. Every muscle wants to tense, every instinct screams to look for pursuers, but that would mark him as suspicious. Wardle sits across from him, head tilted against the glass as if sleeping, but Reid sees the slight tremor in his companion's hands. They are 3 hours from Colditz, heading southwest toward Ulm, then on to the Swiss border near Singen. The compartment smells of coal smoke and unwashed bodies. Autumn rain streaking the windows in the pre-dawn darkness of October 16th. Their forged papers identify them as Fleming and Duprez, French electrical workers traveling to Stuttgart for factory repairs. The documents are good, created over months by the castle's forgery operation, but Reid knows they have never been tested against truly suspicious eyes. Each station brings fresh danger. They must change trains twice more before reaching Switzerland, each transfer another opportunity for disaster. The train lurches, braking for Chemnitz station. Reid's stomach tightens. This is a major junction, meaning more police, more checks, more chances for their descriptions to have arrived. He catches Wardle's eye briefly, seeing the same fear. They had agreed to stay separate, but crowded third-class compartments forced them into proximity. Outside, the platform emerges from the darkness, uniformed figures moving through the waiting crowd. Reid's heart hammers his ribs. He stands, grabs his small case from the overhead rack, and moves toward the corridor. Better to be mobile, to blend with departing passengers. Wardle follows at a distance. The train shudders to a halt. Doors bang open. Cold morning air rushes in, carrying the scent of diesel and wet concrete. Reid steps onto the platform among a surge of workers, head down, shoulders hunched. He walks with purpose toward the main hall. Just another tired laborer. Behind him, voices bark in German. He does not turn. The station's vaulted ceiling echoes with announcements and boot steps. He passes a newsstand with headlines about the Eastern Front and a poster warning citizens to report suspicious persons. Reid's mouth goes dry. He keeps walking. The connection to Ulm departs in 40 minutes from Platform 7. 40 minutes of exposure in this crowded, dangerous space. A hand grips his shoulder. Reid's vision tunnels. He turns slowly, forcing his face into confused neutrality. A railway porter, elderly and irritated. "Rauschen verboten," the man says, pointing at a no-smoking sign. Reid realizes someone behind him was smoking. He nods apologetically and moves on, his legs feeling liquid. That casual touch could have been a Gestapo arrest, the end of everything. He finds a bench near Platform 7, sits, and makes himself breathe normally. Across the concourse, Wardle has positioned himself near a coffee vendor, pretending to read a notice board. They cannot acknowledge each other. Each man is alone now, living or dying on his own performance. 20 meters away, 2 policemen examine the papers of a young man. Reid watches from the corner of his eye. The youth is nervous, fumbling for documents, explaining something in Polish-accented German. One policeman waves him through dismissively. The other continues watching the crowd with bored suspicion. Reid pulls a newspaper from his coat and forces himself to actually read it, turning pages slowly, fighting the urge to check his watch every 30 seconds. Time moves like cold honey. 15 minutes until boarding, then 10. The announcement for the Ulm train crackles through the speakers. Reid stands with other passengers, moving toward Platform 7's entrance. A ticket inspector checks passes, waving people through without real attention. Reid is through, onto the platform. The train waits, steam drifting from beneath the carriages. He finds a third-class car, climbs aboard, and sits by the window facing away from the platform. Wardle appears in the corridor, catches his eye for a fraction of a second, and moves to a different car. Smart. Distance maintains the illusion. The compartment fills with an elderly woman, 2 workers in paint-stained coveralls, and a young soldier on leave who nods a polite greeting and closes his eyes. The train jolts forward. Reid watches Chemnitz slide away. They have cleared another hurdle, Ulm station, change trains, the final leg to Singen, then escape across the border on foot. Each stage multiplies the risk. Each hour increases the likelihood that Colditz has raised the alarm, that descriptions are being telegraphed to every station. He knows the castle's routine. Morning roll call at 7:30. If the escape was discovered then, pursuit began 5 hours ago. If not discovered until later, they might have more time. He cannot know. He can only keep moving, performing this desperate theatre of normalcy. While Reid stares at the rain-soaked countryside, trying to contain his panic, Colditz erupts into chaos. The 7:30 roll call on October 16th proceeds as routine until the numbers come back wrong. 4 men missing from the British quarters. Reid, Wardle, Stevens, Howe, gone. The German duty officer's face drains of colour. An escape is a direct threat to his career, possibly his life. He runs for the commandant's office. Within minutes, alarms shatter the morning quiet. Whistles blow. Guards pour into the courtyard, and prisoners are locked in their quarters. Commandant Prowett takes the news like a physical blow. 4 British officers escaped from the most secure prisoner facility in the Reich. His facility, he storms through the castle, demanding answers. The discovery comes within 20 minutes. A maintenance shed near the park, its lock picked, altered British uniforms hidden inside, footprints in the mud led away from the castle. They walked out, simply walked past the guardhouse in the gathering dusk, dressed as maintenance workers. The audacity is breathtaking, the implications catastrophic. Prowett's rage is incandescent. He summons the sentries who were on duty. They stand at attention, faces grey with terror. They vaguely remember seeing 4 workers leave, carrying tools, and did not challenge them, as workers often departed around that time. Prowett's voice could strip paint. He orders their immediate arrest for dereliction of duty. The sentries are marched away, but the damage is done. The commandant moves to his office and begins making telephone calls, starting with Wehrmacht Regional Security Headquarters in Leipzig. 4 British POWs escaped Colditz around 1800 hours on October 15th, an approximate 13-hour head start. Descriptions are provided: Reid, 30, fluent German; Wardle, 28, adequate German; Stevens and Howe, similar, all resourceful, all dangerous to the Reich. Leipzig security begins alerting every police station, railway junction, and border post within a 600-kilometer radius. Telegrams flow outward like ripples in water, carrying the descriptions and orders: detain on sight. Simultaneously, Prowett orders every remaining British prisoner brought to the courtyard for interrogation. The senior British officer commands cooperation, but the men offer nothing. Nobody knows Reid's route. Searches reveal the forgery operation, confirming how the documents were made, but not where the escapees are. Prowett confines all prisoners to their quarters indefinitely, with reduced rations collective punishment. The German guards search with vindictive thoroughness, destroying personal items, sending a clear message: protect escapees, and you will suffer. By 1000 hours, the pursuit is fully mobilized. The Gestapo dispatches agents to major railway hubs: Stuttgart, Munich, Frankfurt. The Swiss border gets particular attention as the obvious destination. Border posts from Basel to Lake Constance are warned to scrutinize every traveler, especially men in pairs with minimal luggage or with French worker documentation, a known POW cover. The net tightens. Reid cannot know any of this as his train approaches Ulm in the early afternoon. He only knows the danger is absolute. His body aches from tension and hunger, but he cannot risk the dining car's exposure. Wardle is somewhere else in the train, equally isolated, equally terrified. At Ulm, they must change again, board the final train towards Singen and the Swiss frontier. After that, they must cross the border on foot, through zones patrolled by guards with orders to shoot. The train slows entering Ulm station. Through the rain-streaked windows, Reid sees a platform more crowded than Chemnitz, with more uniforms visible. His pulse accelerates. He stands, retrieves his case, and moves into the corridor with other passengers. As he descends to the platform, he is swept toward the main concourse. Ahead, he sees a checkpoint that was not at earlier stations. Police and Wehrmacht soldiers are examining the papers of everyone entering the hall. His blood freezes. This is new. This is because of them. The alarm has reached Ulm. Reid forces himself to keep walking. Stopping or changing direction would draw immediate attention. He is 6 people back in the line, funneling toward the checkpoint. 5, 4. He watches the inspections, thorough but quick. An elderly couple is cleared. A businessman. A woman with 2 children, 3 people ahead now. He grips his case handle, willing himself into the role. Fleming, French electrical worker, tired and annoyed by delays. 2 ahead, a young man is pulled aside for questioning, his accent apparently wrong. The man's fear is palpable as he is escorted to a side office. 1 person ahead. Reid's turn approaches. He cannot see Wardle. He is alone. The person in front clears the checkpoint. Reid steps forward. The policeman is middle-aged, methodical, unsmiling. "Papier," he says. Reid hands over the forged documents, his expression neutral, faintly impatient. The policeman examines them carefully, looks at Reid's face, then back to the papers. "Purpose of travel?" he asks in German. Reid responds in French-accented German. "Electrical work, Stuttgart factory repairs." The policeman's eyes narrow slightly. "You speak German well for a Frenchman." Reid's heart hammers. "Essential for the work?" he says with a shrug. "Germans do not speak French." The policeman stares at him for 5 seconds that last an eternity. Reid does not blink, projecting mild annoyance at the delay. Finally, the policeman hands back the papers and waves him through. Reid walks past without hurrying into the main concourse, his legs trembling so badly he barely maintains his gait. He does not look back. He moves toward the departure board to find the Singen connection. The Singen train departs in 90 minutes from platform 3. Reid finds the waiting area and forces himself to breathe. That checkpoint was too close. He is certain the policeman was suspicious. He survived by seconds, by the strength of the forgeries, by sheer luck. Switzerland is still hours away. First the train to Singen, then the final, impossible task, crossing a militarized border on foot, in darkness. Across the concourse, Wardle emerges from the checkpoint, his face pale but controlled. Both are closer to freedom, and both know the worst is still ahead. The Gestapo net tightens with every passing hour. Their descriptions are being memorized by thousands of searchers. The border will be the most dangerous gauntlet yet. But they have come too far to stop. They will board the Singen train, ride it towards Switzerland, and when the rails end, they will walk into the darkness and trust desperation, preparation, and impossible courage to carry them across the final miles to freedom or death. Chapter 6. Reid and Wardle lay in the ditch, breathing through their mouths to stay silent. The dog kept barking. Somewhere to their left, perhaps 50 meters away, German voices called back and forth. A flashlight beam swept across the field they had just crossed. Reid's legs cramped from the awkward position. muscles screaming after 5 nights of constant movement. His uniform was soaked with dew and sweat. Wardle pressed flat beside him, face turned toward the sound of the patrol. They had been so close when the dog caught something scent or sound, and now they were trapped in a shallow drainage ditch while guards worked a search pattern toward them. The border marker stone was visible from where they lay, perhaps 200 meters ahead across open ground. Beyond it, the dim outline of a Swiss guard post. Freedom was close enough to see, but the patrol stood between them and the invisible line that meant everything. Reid felt Wardle's hand grip his arm, not in fear but in readiness. They had discussed this moment during their planning in Colditz. If caught this close to the border, they would run. Better to die trying than return to captivity. The flashlight beams swung away. The voices moved gradually right. The patrol working a methodical grid. The dog's barking faded slightly as the handler moved with the patrol. Minutes passed like hours. Reid counted his heartbeats, trying to slow his breathing. His body wanted to shake with cold and exhaustion, but he forced absolute stillness. The patrol was thorough because this section of border saw regular escape attempts. The Germans knew prisoners targeted specific crossing points and concentrated their forces accordingly. The patrol moved further right, voices carrying across the ground. Reid lifted his head slightly, scanning for other threats. The Swiss guard post showed a single light in one window. No movement visible. The border marker stone sat alone in the darkness, like a gravestone in an empty field. The sky was beginning to lighten along the eastern horizon, perhaps 30 minutes until full dawn. Once daylight came, crossing the open ground would be suicide. The patrol would see them immediately, and their choice would vanish. Now or never. Reid touched Wardle's shoulder and pointed toward the marker stone. Wardle nodded. They rose slowly from the ditch, knees protesting, backs stiff. The patrol was perhaps 300 meters away now, flashlights still visible but attention focused elsewhere. Reid took a step and his leg buckled. He caught himself. 5 days of constant walking on minimal food had left him weak. Wardle moved beside him, limping on his twisted ankle from 2 nights before. They walked quickly but not running, trying to minimize noise. Each footfall sounded impossibly loud in Reid's ears. The ground was rougher than it appeared, studded with rocks and small holes that threatened to break an ankle. 50 meters covered. The marker stone grew clearer. 100 meters. Reid's breathing came harder now, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Swiss guard post remained dark and quiet. 150 meters. Behind them, the dog barked sharply a different tone. Alert. Discovery. German voices shouted. Flashlights swung back toward them. Reid heard rifles being unslung. Time stopped being a luxury. He ran, his legs pumped, driven by will rather than pure physical capacity. Wardle ran beside him, ungainly and lurching but moving. The marker stone was ahead. 50 meters. German voices shouted commands to halt. Neither man slowed. Reid's vision tunneled until all he could see was that stone marker. 30 meters. His lungs burned. His legs felt like wooden posts barely connected to his body. A rifle shot cracked across the field. Reid couldn't tell where the bullet went. Didn't matter. 10 meters. The stone was there, real and solid. Beyond it, the ground looked identical, but everything was different. Reid's foot crossed the invisible line first, then his body, then Wardle beside him. They had made it. Swiss territory. The Swiss guard post door opened, and 3 soldiers emerged, rifles ready. Reid tried to stop running, but his momentum carried him forward another 5 meters before he could slow. His legs gave out and he fell to his knees. Wardle collapsed beside him, gasping. The Swiss soldiers approached cautiously, weapons raised, shouting in German-accented French. Behind them, at the border marker, German guards had reached the line and stopped. They stood there, rifles ready, shouting across the border. The Swiss soldiers formed a barrier between them, rifles pointed toward Germany. Reid tried to stand and couldn't. His legs had simply quit. He looked up at the Swiss soldier nearest to him, a young man with a shocked expression staring down at the skeletal figure in a torn German civilian suit. Reid's mouth was too dry. He tried to speak, and only a croak emerged. He swallowed, tried again. The words came out hoarse and broken, but clear enough. "We are British officers, escaped from Germany." The Swiss soldier lowered his rifle, looking from his companions to the men on the ground. He said something in French that Reid didn't catch. The German guards across the border were still shouting, demanding the prisoners be returned. The Swiss soldiers ignored them. One knelt beside Reid, offering a canteen. Reid took it with shaking hands and drank. The water was cold and tasted better than anything he could remember. Wardle was drinking from another canteen, his face streaked with dirt and tears. The Swiss soldier helped Reid to his feet. His legs trembled but held. The German guards across the line had fallen silent now, watching with hard faces. One spat on the ground before turning away. The patrol began walking back toward their positions, defeat in every step. The Swiss soldiers escorted Reid and Wardle toward the guard post. Reid looked back once at the marker stone, at Germany beyond it, at the open field they had crossed. The sky was definitely lighter now. In 10 more minutes they would have been visible targets. They had made it by the narrowest margin possible. Inside the guard post, harsh electric light made Reid squint. The Swiss soldiers offered chairs and more water. A phone call was made. Reid heard Swiss German, then French, then careful English asking for confirmation. He answered questions in a voice that sounded distant and strange. Yes. British officers. Yes, escaped from O-Flag IVC Colditz. Yes, we have been travelling 5 days. The officer asked for their names and service numbers, and Reid recited his from memory. Details he had repeated to himself every morning of captivity to remember who he was. Major Pat Reid, Royal Army Service Corps. The officer wrote everything down, asked more questions about their route and how they crossed the border. Reid answered mechanically as his body shut down, safety finally reached. Wardle sat in his chair with eyes closed, still breathing hard. His hands gripped the armrests as though the chair might disappear if he let go. The Swiss soldiers brought bread and cheese, simple rations but more food than Reid had seen in days. He ate slowly, his stomach protesting after subsisting on whatever they could buy or steal during the journey. The bread tasted real. Everything tasted real. The sounds of the guard post were gentle and unthreatening voices speaking calmly, the scratch of pen on paper, the crackle of a radio in another room. No shouted commands, no guards looking for infractions, no locks. Reid felt tears on his face and couldn't remember starting to cry. The Swiss officer finished his phone calls and approached them, speaking in accented but clear English. Transportation would arrive within the hour to take them to an internment facility for processing. He apologized for the internment, but explained Switzerland's strict neutrality. Reid nodded understanding. Internment in Switzerland meant safety, meant being alive, meant the war continuing somewhere else without him for a while. It meant freedom, even if bounded by Swiss territory. The officer asked if they needed medical attention. Reid looked down at his hands, at the cuts and bruises and dirt ground so deep it looked permanent. His feet were masses of blisters. He was probably 30 pounds lighter than when he entered Colditz. Wardle looked worse, his face gaunt and eyes sunken. But they were alive and whole enough. Reid shook his head. Just rest, just safety, just time to believe this was real. The Swiss soldiers gave them blankets, and they sat wrapped in wool, warming slowly, while dawn light filled the windows of the guard post. A military truck arrived as full daylight broke. Swiss soldiers helped them into the back where rough benches lined the canvas-covered bed. The truck drove from Germany deeper into Switzerland. Reid watched the landscape pass through the gap in the canvas. Mountains rose in the distance. Small farms dotted the hillsides. Everything looked clean and untouched by war. The truck drove for an hour before reaching a facility that looked half military base, half hotel. They were escorted to a registration office where a British liaison officer waited, a captain who stood when they entered and saluted. Reid returned the salute automatically and nearly collapsed from the effort. The captain caught his arm and helped him into a chair. Medical orderlies arrived with a stretcher. Reid protested weakly that he could walk, but his legs disagreed. They lifted him onto the stretcher and carried him to a clean room with an actual bed and white sheets. A doctor examined him briefly, noting signs of malnutrition and exhaustion, but nothing immediately life-threatening. Hot food arrived on a tray: soup and bread and weak tea. Reid ate half before exhaustion overwhelmed hunger. The doctor gave him something to help him sleep, and he didn't resist. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness took him was sunlight streaming through a window without bars. When he woke, it was dark outside. A small lamp burned in the corner of the room. Wardle was in the next bed, also asleep, breathing deeply. His body hurt everywhere, but it was honest pain from exertion and hardship, not the dull ache of captivity and hopelessness. He was clean, someone had washed him while he slept. His uniform was replaced with simple cotton pajamas. His feet were bandaged. He reached out and touched the sheets. Real. He touched the wall beside the bed. Real. He listened to the sounds of the facility, distant voices, footsteps in hallways, normal sounds of people living without fear. Real. The British liaison captain visited the next morning, bringing official forms and coffee that tasted like the finest luxury Reid had ever experienced. The captain explained that debriefing would begin soon. Intelligence officers wanted to hear about Colditz, its defenses, its routines, the other prisoners held there. Reid's information would be valuable for helping other potential escapers. The captain mentioned that Reid's escape was the first successful one from Colditz to reach Allied territory. That information would need to be carefully managed for security while used for morale. Reid listened and nodded, but part of him was still in that ditch near the border, still counting heartbeats while the patrol searched. The captain left, and Reid sat alone with his coffee, watching the morning light on the mountains visible through the window. Wardle woke shortly after, and they shared a quiet breakfast, not talking much. Everything that needed to be said was contained in the fact that they were eating breakfast in Switzerland instead of standing for morning roll call in Colditz. Days followed in a strange limbo of medical care, good food, and gentle debriefing sessions. Reid described the layout of Colditz in detail for intelligence officers who took notes and asked careful questions. He explained the escape route they had used, though he carefully avoided specifics that might compromise the officers still working on other attempts. The intelligence officers pressed him on German morale, on guard procedures, on anything he might have observed during the journey across Germany. He gave them what he could while protecting what he must. Weeks became months. Reid recovered physically, weight returned to his frame, color to his face, strength to his legs. But sleep remained difficult. He dreamed of patrols and dogs, of waking in Colditz to discover Switzerland had been a dream. He woke in darkness, reaching for escape tools that weren't there, planning routes through a castle he had left behind. Freedom was real and solid. Living with it took adjustment. The war continued beyond Swiss borders. News filtered in of Allied advances and setbacks, of other prisoners and other camps. Reid thought constantly of the men still in Colditz, still planning, still trying. His escape had proved it could be done. That knowledge would spread among the prisoners and might give hope or might invite greater German vigilance. Both outcomes weighed on him. He had made it out. His responsibility now was to ensure his escape meant something beyond personal freedom. In early 1943, arrangements were completed for Reid's repatriation to Britain through a diplomatic exchange. He said goodbye to Wardle, who would follow in a subsequent exchange. They shook hands without dramatics, two men who had shared an impossible journey and survived it together. Everything important was understood. The journey to Britain took weeks through neutral territories and by air from Gibraltar. Reid arrived in London in late March 1943, more than 2.5 years after his capture in France and 5 months after crossing the Swiss border. He reported to military headquarters and was absorbed into the intelligence apparatus for returned prisoners. He spent weeks in debriefing, describing Colditz in greater detail than he ever had in Switzerland. His information contributed to intelligence assessments and planning for camp liberation. But mostly, he discovered, his value was symbolic. He was proof that escape from even the most secure camps was possible. That proof mattered for morale, for propaganda, for maintaining the spirit that had driven him to try. Freedom had been the goal. Recognition for what it took to achieve that freedom would be earned slowly over years and decades. His war wasn't over, it had simply changed form from physical escape to preserving the memory of what was endured and what had been achieved through courage and determination that refused to accept impossible odds. Chapter 7. Post-1945. After his escape, Major Pat Reid was appointed MBE, Member of the Order of the British Empire, for his services to intelligence gathering and escape operations while a prisoner of war. He returned to England in October 1942, gaunt and exhausted. The debriefing at the War Office lasted 3 days, with intelligence officers hungry for every detail: guard schedules, German morale, camp layout, and the psychology of Colditz's security. Reid's information contributed directly to the refinement of MI9's escape and evasion training protocols. His detailed descriptions of forgery techniques and weaknesses in German security procedures became classified material distributed to RAF and Army intelligence units, preparing briefings for aircrews. After a quiet decoration ceremony, he returned to uniform, assigned to staff duties that kept him far from the front lines. The Army recognized that men who had escaped carried knowledge too valuable to risk in combat again. His post-war career took him into civil engineering, his peacetime profession, but Colditz refused to release him. Fellow escapers stayed in touch, with letters arriving from France, Canada, and New Zealand men writing to the one person who truly understood what those years behind the wire had meant. In 1950, Reid began organizing his wartime notes and letters. His wife, who had lived with his nightmares for 5 years, encouraged him, hoping the act of writing would bring peace and that others needed to know the story. In 1952, Hodder and Staunton published Times' The Colditz Story*. Reid's worries that no one would care about old escape tales proved spectacularly wrong. The book became an immediate bestseller in Britain and America, eventually translated into 16 languages. Readers were hungry for stories that combined adventure with verifiable truth. Reid's understated factual narrative, occasionally dry with British humour, lent it high credibility. He named names, cited dates, and described failures as thoroughly as successes. The book captured a need in the early 1,952 public. Proof that individual resistance mattered, that ingenuity and courage could prevail even in the most controlled environments of the Nazi state. The 1955 film followed, with John Mills playing Reid. Though taking liberties with chronology and character and inventing a romance, its core remained: Colditz as the ultimate challenge, and escape as an assertion of human dignity. The film reached millions who would never read the book, cementing Colditz in popular culture as shorthand for impossible odds overcome through cleverness and determination. Reid consulted on the film, ensuring technical accuracy in the escape sequences while accepting Hollywood's dramatic necessities. His co-escapers attended the London premiere. For some, seeing their story on screen was cathartic, but for others, it was deeply uncomfortable, too clean, too heroic, missing the cold, the hunger, and the men who never made it home. Reid published Times' The Latter Days at Colditz Times in 1953, covering the period after his own escape through to the camp's liberation in April 1945. This volume relied on accounts from prisoners who had remained, documents captured by American forces, and interviews with fellow POWs. It was harder to write. The later years at Colditz had been grimmer, with scarcer food and harsher reprisals. Several men had been executed, and others died in punishment camps after failed escapes. Reid felt an obligation to tell those stories too, honoring the men whose attempts ended in tragedy. The book sold well but never matched the success of the first volume. Readers clearly preferred the earlier, successful escapes that ended in freedom. What Reid did not publicize was how much Colditz had marked him. His engineering career prospered, yet colleagues noticed he could not tolerate enclosed spaces without windows. He avoided Germany entirely until 1967. His children grew up knowing their father had escaped from a castle, but understood somehow that they should not ask for details. The details came out in the books. At home, Reid was quiet about the war. The nightmares persisted, dreams of recapture, of hiding while search parties closed in, of reaching the Swiss border only to find it had moved. His wife learned not to wake him suddenly. The cost of escape had not ended with his arrival in Switzerland. Reid's decision to become the chronicler of Colditz ensured the castle would not be forgotten. Other POW camps faded from public memory. Stalag Luft III achieved brief fame through Time's The Great Escape *, then receded into specialized military history. Colditz remained vivid because Reid kept it alive, corresponding with historians and providing photographs and documents to researchers. When the BBC approached him in 1972 about a television series, he was 70 years old and suffering from the heart condition that would kill him 2 years later. He agreed to consult. The series, which ran from 1972 to 1974, became a cultural phenomenon in Britain. 28 meticulously researched episodes dramatized the escape attempts Reid had documented, introducing a new generation to Colditz. Reid watched the early episodes. While noting inaccuracies, he acknowledged they had captured the essential atmosphere of boredom, tension, and constant tactical thinking that defined life in the castle. The television series created a Colditz mythology that sometimes overshadowed reality. Popular imagination remembered the successful escapes, forgetting that the castle's security was formidable precisely because so many attempts failed. Reid had documented 30 major escape attempts during his time there. Only 15 men reached neutral territory. More than 200 others were recaptured, often within hours. Some were shot, others spent months in solitary confinement. The mythology emphasized ingenuity and glossed over this cost. Reid understood this was inevitable. The public needed heroes, but the men who lived it knew the truth was more complicated. Reid died in 1974, shortly after the BBC series began its second season. His obituaries focused on Colditz. His engineering career, family, and post-war decades were all condensed into final paragraphs. The escape defined him publicly, even as he worked for 30 years to ensure it defined an entire generation of prisoners, not just himself. His books remained in print, the 1955 film played regularly on television, and the BBC series was sold internationally. Colditz became Britain's most famous prisoner of war story, more celebrated than the tunnels of Stalag Luft III and more romanticized than the camps in the Far East, where conditions had been incomparably worse. What Reid had done was preserve institutional memory at a moment when the military needed it. The Code of Conduct for members of the armed forces, formalized by President Eisenhower in 1955, codified principles men like Reid had lived. Article 4. If I become a prisoner of war, I will keep faith with my fellow prisoners, reflected the mutual support networks of Colditz's escape operations. Article 5. I will make every effort to escape, enshrined as policy what Reid's generation practiced as duty. His books became unofficial training material, assigned at military academies not for adventure, but for practical lessons in organization, morale maintenance, and psychological resistance. The Royal Air Force's Survival School, included Reid's account in its curriculum through the 1,980 with instructors referencing specific Colditz escapes for lessons on everything from analyzing guard patterns to preparing for solitary confinement. Intelligence services studied Reid's work for different reasons. The escapers from Colditz had gathered and transmitted information about German security, troop movements, and guard morale. Reid's debriefing had enriched MI9's understanding of German POW administration, and his books documented how military intelligence could be gathered even from maximum security confinement. During the Cold War, as NATO planned for the possibility of air crews held in Soviet camps, Reid's emphasis on maintaining intelligence efforts in captivity influenced resistance training protocols. While specific techniques dated, the principles remained relevant. The Colditz Castle itself became a museum in 1996 after German reunification. The East German government had used it as a psychiatric hospital, obscuring its wartime history. During restoration, curators sought surviving prisoners, but few remained. Reid's books, however, provided the blueprint for reconstruction. The rooms where escape equipment was made, the attics where tunnels began, and the courtyard where rappels were held could all be mapped from his detailed descriptions. The museum drew visitors because of the books and television series. Tourists walked through spaces made famous by Reid's narrative, seeing the actual windows Airy Neve climbed through and the route Reid himself had taken. The castle became a memorial, not to one escape, but to the entire culture of resistance Reid had documented. Modern military training still references Colditz, though the context has evolved. At the U.S. Navy's Sear School, instructors teaching resistance to interrogation cite Reid's emphasis on maintaining mental discipline through routine and purposeful activity. The escape attempts themselves matter less than the mindset Reid described. The refusal to accept confinement as permanent and the commitment to making captors expend resources on security. British Army doctrine on conduct after capture includes Colditz as a case study in effective prisoner self-organization, teaching tactical lessons on leadership structures, information security, and morale operations. What has faded is the romantic gloss of the 1,970 television series. Contemporary military historians recognize Colditz as an anomaly, a camp where relatively privileged officers with technical skills and time achieved limited tactical success. The survival rates and conditions in the Pacific theater, the death marches in Europe, and the treatment of Soviet prisoners represent the reality of captivity for most. Reid's narrative, focused on his own experience, captured a specific slice of the POW world. But his determination to document it comprehensively, naming the men who failed alongside those who succeeded, gave military historians a detailed case study with lessons applicable far beyond one castle in Saxony. The 4 men who walked out of Colditz in October 1942, Reid, Ronnie Littledale, Billy Stevens, and Hank Wardle, represented something Reid spent his life trying to articulate. Not heroism in the conventional sense, but the stubborn insistence that capture was a tactical situation, not a permanent condition, that duty continued behind the wire. They showed that ingenuity, patience, and mutual support could exploit even small weaknesses in totalitarian control. Reid's books are still read not to glorify escape, but because they demonstrate, with meticulous documentation, that resistance remained possible when the enemy controlled every obvious path. Successful resistance looked like compliance until the moment it didn't. The lessons Reid preserved remain in training archives and doctrine, taught to service members who may never face captivity, but who understand that the will to resist begins long before capture. Reid's legacy was not the single escape. It was ensuring that the knowledge survived, the example persisted, and future generations would know that walls are never absolute, and dignity once claimed cannot be taken without consent.